Ethan Parker's hands tightened around the steering wheel as he rounded the last bend of Willow Creek Road. Something felt off. The golden wheat fields that had defined his family's land for 4 generations were gone, replaced by a towering 3-story hotel. Its pristine glass windows gleamed under the morning sun, reflecting a future he had never agreed to. He pulled over, his heart pounding. Just a month ago, before leaving for a critical consulting job overseas, this was his farm. He and his wife, Isabella, had gone over every legal detail to protect it. And yet, here it stood, a monstrous structure complete with manicured lawns, a massive parking lot, and bright construction barriers. A worker in a hard hat noticed him. "Can I help you?" he asked, his clipboard tucked under his arm. Ethan stepped out of his truck, his voice firm. "This is my land. I'm Ethan Parker." The worker's hesitation spoke volumes. Then his phone buzzed, a text from Isabella. "Ethan, emergency, call me ASAP." His eyes locked onto a sign near the entrance. Willow Creek Community Development approved by HOA Board. Project Director, Karen Reynolds. A slow, burning realization hit him. This was no accident. This was a theft. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at the sign. Karen Reynolds. The name alone sent a wave of anger through him. She was the president of the HOA, the same woman who had spent years complaining about his farm. The overgrown fences, the dust from the dirt road, the unsightly tractors. She had always made it clear that his family's land didn't belong in her perfect vision of Willow Creek. But this was war. He forced himself to take a breath, his mind racing through possibilities. Had they forged documents, bribed officials, manipulated zoning laws? He needed proof. Ignoring the worker's uneasy stare, Ethan strode toward a table stacked with documents. Zoning approvals, construction permits, and signed agreements, all bearing Karen's signature. One paper in particular caught his eye. Community Improvement Zone Approval, Expedited Development. The language was slippery, not illegal, but highly manipulative. The kind of loophole only a lawyer or a corrupt official could exploit. "Sir, you really can't be here." The worker tried again, shifting uncomfortably. Ethan turned to him, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry," he said coolly. "I won't be here for long." He snapped a few pictures of the documents with his phone, then climbed back into his truck. But instead of heading home, he drove straight into town. The first clue. The aroma of fresh coffee barely registered as Ethan stepped into the Oakwood Cafe, his usual haunt. He slid into a booth, pulling out a worn leather notebook. Every good fight needed a strategy, and he wasn't about to charge into battle unprepared. He listed out what he knew. His farm had been rezoned while he was away. Karen Reynolds and the HOA had pushed the project through in record time. The paperwork hinted at legal gray areas, but he needed something stronger. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Isabella. "Ethan, where are you? You need to see what I found in the barn." The barn. His grandfather had always been meticulous about record keeping. Could the answers be hiding there all along? Ethan downed the rest of his coffee, threw a few bills on the table, and rushed out the door. A legacy of secrets, dust motes floated in the fading afternoon light as Ethan stepped into the barn. Isabella stood near an old wooden cabinet, a stack of yellowed documents spread across a workbench. "You're not going to believe this," she whispered. Ethan's breath caught as he scanned the pages. Handwritten maps, deeds, correspondence dating back over 70 years. One particular letter, signed by his grandfather, sent a chill down his spine. This land is protected under an irrevocable trust. It can never be sold, transferred, or developed without direct approval from the Parker family. Ethan's fingers tightened around the paper. Karen Reynolds had no idea what she had just walked into. Ethan's grip tightened around the document. His grandfather had known. He had planned for this. This trust wasn't just a legal technicality. It was a wall of protection, one that Karen Reynolds and the HOA had completely ignored. "I can't believe they thought they could get away with this," Isabella murmured, flipping through more documents. "Your grandfather wasn't just a farmer. He was a strategist." Ethan exhaled sharply. Karen has no idea what's coming. Then, a sound outside. The unmistakable crunch of gravel under tires. Ethan darted to the barn's small window, peering through a gap in the wooden planks. A sleek white SUV rolled to a stop near the property line. His stomach turned. HOA parking stickers. And then he saw her. Karen Reynolds stepped out, adjusting her designer sunglasses. Even from a distance, Ethan could see her expression, cold, calculating. She held a clipboard, making notes, scanning his land like she already owned it. She was checking inventory. "Unbelievable," Ethan muttered under his breath. "Ethan," Isabella whispered urgently. She pointed at his phone. "Take pictures." He didn't need to be told twice. Snap, snap. Every move Karen made was now evidence. Karen turned, her gaze sweeping over the barn. Ethan held his breath, pressing himself deeper into the shadows. If she found out he was watching, she might speed up whatever plan she had next. Then, she pulled out her phone. Ethan's own phone buzzed at the exact same moment. A text from Marcus, their lawyer. "Found something interesting. Call me ASAP." Ethan's pulse quickened. He needed to talk to Marcus right now. But first, he had to know what Karen was up to. The HOA's power play, Karen stood near what used to be Ethan's wheat field, the towering hotel looming behind her. Another HOA member, a man in a gray suit, walked up beside her. Ethan recognized him from town meetings. Michael Sterling, a real estate developer. The two exchanged words, too far away for Ethan to hear. But then, Sterling handed Karen a thick envelope. Ethan's jaw clenched. Bribe? Contracts? Something worse? Karen flipped through the papers, then nodded. Sterling clapped her on the back before striding away. She turned toward the barn one last time, her sunglasses hiding her expression. Then, without another word, she climbed back into her SUV and drove off, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and a gnawing sense of urgency. A race against time. Ethan bolted back inside the house, Isabella close behind. He hit the call button on his phone. Marcus answered immediately. "Ethan, listen carefully. I found a major flaw in their paperwork. If we act fast, we can stop them before it's too late." Ethan glanced at the documents spread across the table. The past held answers, but the real battle was just beginning. Ethan paced the length of his kitchen, phone pressed against his ear. "What did you find?" Marcus's voice was sharp. "A loophole, Ethan. They rushed the development approvals. They never did an official environmental impact study. That land, your land, includes a protected wetland zone. If we push this, their entire project could be shut down." Ethan stopped in his tracks. "You're telling me this hotel is illegal?" "Oh, it's worse than illegal," Marcus said. "It's a lawsuit waiting to happen." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "Karen and Sterling were just here." He handed her an envelope. "Any chance they found out about this before us?" "Possible," Marcus admitted. But if that's the case, they'll try to bury the evidence. We need to act fast. Ethan's jaw tightened. Karen had spent years treating his farm like a nuisance. Now she had tried to erase it completely, but she had made a fatal mistake, and Ethan was about to make sure she paid for it. A hidden pattern. Isabella had been listening, flipping through the old property documents as Ethan spoke. Now she tapped one page and pushed it toward him. "Ethan," she said, voice urgent. "Look at this." It was an old zoning map, dating back nearly a century. Their farm was marked clearly, but so was something else. A red boundary line ran through part of the land and directly under the hotel. Next to it, handwritten in small, precise script, was a note. Wetlands preservation. No development permitted. Ethan's stomach dropped. His grandfather had known. This wasn't new. The land had been protected for decades. "This isn't just about HOA corruption," Isabella said, eyes flashing. "This is a cover-up. They knew this was protected land. They knew, and they built the hotel anyway." Ethan swallowed hard. This was bigger than just his family's farm. If Karen had pulled this off here, how many other developments had been illegally approved? "We have to go public," Isabella said. Ethan nodded. "We will. But first, we need more proof." A dangerous game. The next morning, Ethan and Isabella drove to City Hall. Marcus had pulled some strings and arranged a meeting with Martha Jensen, a former city planner who had retired under suspicious circumstances. She met them in a small, dimly lit office, her sharp eyes scanning their documents. "I tried to stop this," Martha muttered, flipping through the papers. "Karen used her connections to override the zoning board. Any protest got buried. They forced me out when I pushed too hard." Ethan leaned forward. "Martha, if you testify, we can take them down." She hesitated. Then, finally, she sighed. "I'll do it." Ethan exhaled, relief washing over him. Karen had spent years controlling this town. That control was about to end. Ethan's heart pounded as he shook Martha's hand. This was it. The first real crack in Karen's control. "We need this testimony," Ethan said. "Karen's gotten away with too much for too long." Martha nodded, her eyes sharp. "I'll testify. But you need more than just my word. You need irrefutable proof." Ethan exchanged a glance with Isabella. They already had the old zoning maps, the wetlands protection documents, and Marcus's legal expertise. But they needed something more. Something that would make it impossible for Karen to wriggle out of this. Then, Martha leaned in. "I have access to the original city planning archives." Ethan stiffened. "You mean the ones Karen tried to bury?" Martha smirked. "Exactly. Breaking the HOA's grip." That night, Ethan met Marcus at his law office. The room was filled with documents, blueprints, emails, city council meeting notes. But one file stood out. Willow Creek HOA, land development proposals, confidential. Marcus slid it across the table. "This is what we've been looking for." Ethan flipped through the pages, his pulse quickening. It was all here. HOA meeting minutes where Karen pressured officials into approving the hotel. Emails between Karen and Sterling, discussing how to fast-track the permits before anyone noticed. A leaked internal memo where Sterling admitted they knew about the wetlands, but planned to handle any issues if they arise. "They knew," Ethan whispered. "They knew the land was protected, and they built anyway." Marcus nodded. "And if we bring this to court, they're finished." Isabella leaned over Ethan's shoulder. "How do we make sure they can't cover this up?" Marcus smiled. "We go public. Big. The power of exposure." The next morning, Ethan and Isabella met with Jack Miller, an investigative journalist from the Willow Creek Herald. Jack had been sniffing around HOA corruption for years, but he had never found anything solid until now. Ethan spread the documents across the table. "You want a story? This is the biggest HOA scandal this town has ever seen." Jack whistled, flipping through the pages. Illegal land grabs, environmental violations, fraud. This isn't just a scandal. This is criminal. He snapped his notebook shut. "I'll run the story, but Karen's going to fight back." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Let her. We're ready." The fallout begins. By noon, the Willow Creek Herald had published its front-page story. HOA caught in land scandal. Illegal hotel development exposed. The town erupted. Residents who had been afraid to speak out suddenly found their voices. More victims came forward. People Karen had bullied. Homeowners forced to sell. Karen had spent years manipulating the system. But now, the system was turning against her. Ethan stood at the edge of his property, watching as the town reacted to the bombshell news. It had only been a few hours since the Willow Creek Herald published their exposé, but the fallout was spreading faster than wildfire. Karen Reynolds had ruled the HOA with an iron grip for years, using fear and manipulation to get what she wanted. But now, people were fighting back. A group of homeowners had gathered outside the community center, holding signs demanding her resignation. Local news stations had picked up the story, and HOA board members were suddenly scrambling to distance themselves from Karen. Ethan felt a hand on his shoulder. "Isabella." "Look at them," she whispered. "They're finally standing up to her." Ethan exhaled. "Yeah, but Karen won't go down without a fight." And he was right. Karen's last stand that afternoon, the HOA held an emergency meeting. The community center was packed. Residents, reporters, even town officials. Karen sat at the front, her usual calm, calculated demeanor slipping. She cleared her throat. "These accusations are baseless," she declared, her voice tight. "This so-called evidence is nothing more than a misunderstanding." Ethan stepped forward. "A misunderstanding?" He pulled out a stack of documents. "Then explain these." He laid out emails proving Karen pressured city officials into ignoring zoning laws, the environmental impact reports she had buried, testimonies from multiple homeowners who had been forced to sell under threat of legal action. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Karen's face drained of color. A man stood up, Justin Harper, a younger HOA board member. He hesitated before speaking. "I was on the board when Karen pushed this project through," he admitted. "She made sure anyone who objected was silenced. I regret not speaking up sooner." The room exploded. More board members stood, turning against Karen. Ethan watched as Karen's power crumbled before his eyes. The tables turned. By the end of the meeting, the HOA voted to remove Karen as president. But Ethan knew this wasn't over. Marcus met him outside. "We still have the lawsuit," he reminded. "She could still try to fight this in court." Ethan nodded. "Let her. She's got nothing left." Isabella squeezed his hand. "We didn't just save our land, Ethan. We changed this town." He looked around. Neighbors who once lived in fear were now empowered, finally free from Karen's influence. Ethan had never wanted to be a leader. But standing here, watching his community reclaim its voice, he realized, sometimes the right fight finds you. And when it does, you have two choices: run or rise. Ethan had chosen to rise. Ethan stood on the porch of his farmhouse, watching the town transform before his eyes. Just weeks ago, fear ruled Willow Creek. Karen Reynolds and the HOA had held all the power. their influence stretching across every property, every decision, every voice. But now, everything had changed. The hotel, once a symbol of greed and corruption, now stood half abandoned. Construction had been halted. Investigations were underway. The wetlands violations alone had opened up lawsuits that threatened to bankrupt the developers. Sterling, Karen's real estate partner, had vanished from public view, and several city officials had quietly resigned. Karen herself, facing multiple lawsuits, a federal environmental probe, and a town that had turned against her. She had spent years intimidating and manipulating people. But when the truth finally caught up with her, there was nowhere left to run. Ethan exhaled, gripping the wooden railing. The land beneath his feet was still his. The farm, his family's legacy, had survived. And not just for him, for everyone. A community reborn. The following week, a town hall meeting was held. But this time, things were different. Instead of Karen's cold, controlling presence, new leaders had stepped forward, people who actually cared about the town. Ethan sat near the back, arms crossed, listening as his neighbors debated the future. Justin Harper, the former HOA board member who had turned against Karen, now stood at the podium. "We were wrong," he admitted. "For years, we let someone like Karen dictate what was best for us, but we don't have to live that way anymore." The room was silent. Then, a slow ripple of applause. Martha, the former city planner, stood up next. "It's time we put control of this town back into the hands of the people who actually live here." Ethan couldn't help but smile. This was what he had fought for. Not just to save his farm, but to save his town. A legacy that lasts. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and Isabella walked the fields together. The wheat had started to regrow. The land, despite everything, was healing. Isabella squeezed his hand. "You did it," she whispered. Ethan shook his head. "We did it." She smiled. "What now?" Ethan looked over his land, the same land his grandfather had protected all those years ago. "We rebuild," he said simply. "Not just the farm, not just the land, but everything. The community, the trust, the future." Karen had tried to steal his legacy. Instead, she had made him stronger. Ethan had never wanted to be a fighter. He had been raised to believe in hard work, honesty, and the value of legacy. But when someone tried to steal everything his family had built, he realized an undeniable truth. The only way to keep what's yours is to stand up and fight for it. Too often, powerful people, HOAs, corporations, corrupt officials, believe they can steamroll over everyday citizens. They count on fear. They assume that no one will question them, challenge them, or demand accountability. But Ethan proved them wrong. By digging into his family's past, by using the very laws they tried to exploit, he turned the tables. He didn't just win back his farm. He exposed an entire system of corruption, saving his community in the process. The lesson? Document everything. Know your rights. Never assume someone else will fight for you. Most importantly, when faced with injustice, don't stay silent. Because the moment you stand up, speak out, and fight back, you take back the power they thought they had over you. Ethan's story is fictional, but scenarios like this happen every day. Homeowners face abusive HOAs, unjust land seizures, and manipulative zoning laws across the country. So what can you do? Know your property rights. Research your local zoning laws, HOA bylaws, and environmental protections. Don't assume they're working in your favor. Keep records. Save property deeds, meeting notes, emails, and contracts. If a dispute arises, Documentation is your strongest weapon. Build alliances. If you're being targeted, chances are others are too. Talk to neighbors, gather support, and stand together. Use the media. If legal action isn't enough, public exposure can create pressure that no corrupt official can ignore. Never back down. People like Karen thrive on intimidation, but the moment you push back, they lose their power. The fight for justice starts with one voice. Will yours be next?